Here is the part almost everyone gets backwards. In June 2026, the United States and Iran signed a memorandum that declares an end to the war in Lebanon, on all fronts, in its own words. But read the signature page. The two countries actually doing the fighting on that front, Israel and Hezbollah, never signed it. Neither is even a party to it. So the veterans signed a deal to end a war the actual fighters never agreed to stop. That is not a footnote. On the analysis I'll walk you through today, it is the load-bearing flaw in the whole structure. I'm Naim Tahir Baig. Let's do this carefully. This is a deep dive into a single research paper and a single sharp claim. The claim is in the title. What was reached in June 2026 is a ceasefire architecture, not a peace. A structure that stands only while it is actively held up, not a settlement that resolves anything. 58. And before we go one step further, a promise about how I'll handle it. Here's my promise about method. I'm not here to cheer for a flag. I'm going to run a framework, test it against the evidence, and follow that evidence wherever it leads, including to conclusions some viewers won't like. But following the evidence honestly is not the same as pretending all sides bear it equally. When the documented record shows who is doing the killing and who could have stopped it, I'm going to say so plainly, with every figure sourced. And I'll hold myself to the discipline that makes that credible. I'll build the strongest case against my own argument before I rest on it. If a claim can't survive its best counter-argument, it doesn't deserve to persuade you, and it won't persuade you here. Here's the route. 1. The puzzle, a truce announced and broken in a single news cycle. 2. The central idea that two separate negotiations are secretly one machine. 3. The documents and a hidden asymmetry inside them. 4. 3 rival theories put in a cage match over one violent day. 5. The question that decides everything, whether the deal's guarantor could actually stop the killing. And 6. What all of this means for the country that brokered it, Pakistan, and 3 dated predictions you can check me on. Start with the puzzle. Friday, the 19th of June 2026, United States officials confirmed that Israel and Hezbollah have agreed to a ceasefire, the latest in a long line of them. The same day, Israeli strikes kill dozens of people in Lebanon. The heaviest toll falls in the Nabatieh governorate and the eastern Bekaa, near Baalbek. An Israeli military official says Hezbollah fired more than 50 projectiles overnight. The truce was announced and breached inside one news cycle. And 2 days earlier, on the 17th, Washington and Tehran had concluded a 14-point memorandum meant to end their war. The Strait of Hormuz reopened to commercial traffic. And yet, the very first round of follow-on talks in Switzerland was promptly called off because Iran demanded a halt to the fighting in Lebanon. A peace framework signed and immediately stalled. A ceasefire declared and immediately broken. Ordinary news framing can't hold those two facts together. The paper's wager is that one idea can. Step back and the 19th stops looking like an accident. Look at the pattern. November 2024. A ceasefire, built on UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Then, through 2026, a cascade. A 10-day truce in April, extended 3 weeks, extended 45 days. A conditional full ceasefire in June that Hezbollah rejects. And throughout, strikes recorded during the very truces that were supposed to stop them. Each truce declared, each one punctured. The paper's appendix is unusually honest about this chart, and I want to be too. The event dates are from contemporaneous reporting, but the recurrence claim does not hinge on any single contested strike. Pull out the most uncertain row and the announced then broken rhythm is still right there. That rhythm, not any one day, is the thing to explain. So what kind of machine produces that rhythm? Here's the central idea. Most coverage treats these as two stories. A Lebanon war over here, a US-Iran negotiation over there. The paper argues they are one coupled bargaining system. Battlefield events in Lebanon feed into the Geneva table, and the Geneva table feeds back into Lebanon. Think of it as two clocks wired together. A strike near Nabatieh isn't just a strike anymore. It's an input into a negotiation about sanctions, shipping, and Iran's nuclear file. And a demand at the negotiating table isn't just diplomacy. It reaches back and reshapes what happens on the ground. Now, a claim like "it's all connected" is the easiest thing in the world to assert and the hardest to disprove, which is exactly why the paper does something I respect. Before testing the idea, it states in advance what would prove it wrong. This is the methodological spine and I'm keeping it tight. The thesis is only useful if it can fail. So the paper specifies 5 observable indicators, each with a tight coupling reading and a loose coupling reading. Does the Geneva calendar move when Lebanon escalates or run on its own logic? Does a party openly tie one track to the other or treat them as separate? Does the memorandum's text actually name Lebanon or stay silent on it? Do the same mediators shuttle between both tables or are the channels completely separate? And finally, are battlefield moves deliberately timed to negotiation milestones? If the calendar were indifferent to Lebanon, the text silent, the mediators separate, the coupling claim would be falsified. That's the deal the paper makes with us. Let's run the test. 4 of the 5 indicators point the same way. Timing. The first Geneva round was called off as Iran sought a halt to the Lebanon fighting. The Swiss Foreign Ministry confirmed the meeting would not proceed. That's an observed fact, not an inference. Conditionality. Iranian officials openly listed an end to the Lebanon conflict among the things that had to happen before substantive talks. Textual linkage. The memorandum names Lebanon in its very first clause. Mediator behavior. The same US principles worked both tracks. 4 for 4. Tight coupling. The fifth, whether strikes are deliberately timed as signals, the paper deliberately sets aside. And this is the move that earns my trust. It says co-occurrence is visible, but intent behind the timing can't be separated from coincidence without inside access no analyst has. So rather than let an untestable indicator prop up the conclusion, it throws that indicator out and rests the case on the 4 you can observe. That's a conservative call. It concedes the strongest objection's best point and still stands, which brings us to that objection. Let me build the other side's case as strongly as I can, because this is where intellectual honesty actually lives. The objection runs like this. The violence around Nabatieh and the Litani is autonomous. It's the local Israeli-Hezbollah fight, border skirmishing, drone strikes on vehicles, projectile fire, displacement orders, running on a tactical tempo of its own. This front had its own grinding logic for nearly 2 years. There were documented strikes during every prior truce window, with no external talks anywhere in the picture. Residents described near continuous attacks tied to no negotiation milestone at all. On this reading, the strikes aren't inputs into anything. They're a self-sustaining war that would continue with or without a memorandum. And the elegant coupling story is just a narrative that mediators and commentators draped over local violence after the fact. I want to be clear, that is a serious objection. It is not a straw man. If it's right, the central thesis is mostly decoration. So, how does the paper answer it without cheating? The answer is a distinction, and it's the cleverest move in the paper. Separate the generation of violence from its transmission. Concede the objection's whole first half. Yes, the violence is locally generated. Spoilers need a steady supply of friction, and southern Lebanon supplies it on its own. The paper does not fight that. What it denies is that local generation means the strikes don't travel. 3 things settle it. First, the conditionality came from the parties, not the commentators. Tehran, not an analyst, made an end to the Lebanon fighting a precondition for Geneva. Second, the negotiation calendar demonstrably moved. The cancelled round is an observed event, not a theory. Third, and this is the hinge, the same local strike now carries amplified consequences it never carried before. A drone strike that in 2025 killed 1 Hezbollah member and rippled no further could, in June 2026, delay talks bearing on sanctions, shipping, and the nuclear file. Coupling never required that Geneva causes the strikes. It only requires that the strikes feed into Geneva. The objection correctly describes where the violence is born, and wrongly concludes it stays local. Generation is conceded. Transmission is the finding. Now the documents, because the most important finding here isn't about events at all. It's hiding in the language. The settlement rests on 3 documentary layers. The November 2024 ceasefire and the resolution behind it. The 14-point memorandum of June 2026. And a unifil statement from the peacekeepers on the ground. Read them not as news, but as legal political texts, asking the lawyer's question, who is obligated to do what? And an asymmetry appears that the word ceasefire completely hides. Start with the 2024 baseline, because the 2026 deal inherits its skeleton. Here is the 2024 language as published. The government of Lebanon will prevent Hezbollah and all armed groups from carrying out, quote, any operations against Israel, and Israel will not carry out, quote, any offensive military operations against Lebanese targets. Read those two halves again. Hezbollah's obligation is total and unconditional any operations. Israel's is qualified by a single word, offensive, and a separate clause preserves each side's inherent right of self-defense. On this reading, that asymmetry isn't incidental, it's structural. It hands one side a textual license to characterize strikes as defensive responses to alleged violations, while the other side's any operations bar admits no matching exception. And the resolution underneath it all, 1701, called for Israeli withdrawal from the south and for Hezbollah to pull north of the Litani and ultimately disarm. Provisions that, as UNIFIL itself acknowledged, were never fully enforced. The peacekeepers' own statement urged that actions risking the cessation must cease and pressed for the withdrawal of Israeli forces, which is diplomatic language that, read closely, records non-compliance. The asymmetry was there from the start. The 2026 deal builds on top of it. Now the memorandum itself and two features that decide everything. Its first clause declares the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and commits the parties to Lebanon's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Feature 1, and we opened with it. That Lebanon clause binds the United States and Iran, not the belligerents. Israel is not a party and appears nowhere in the Lebanon provision. Hezbollah is referenced only obliquely. The instrument purports to end a war whose fighters never signed it. Reporting noted the text makes no mention of Israel, even though Israeli forces occupy part of Lebanon and have struck it near daily, and Israel publicly stated it would not withdraw from border regions and reserved the right to act against Hezbollah. Features 2. The deal defers its hardest questions to a 60-day negotiation extendable with mutual consent. The nuclear file, the future of the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions, frozen assets. And on Lebanon, the accompanying US statement framed support for Hezbollah's disarmament, which means the single issue Hezbollah and Israel are furthest apart on is named as the goal and left wholly unresolved. The spoiler literature has a word for that structure, combustible. Here's where most analysis gets lazy. It sprinkles three theories on top of each other as garnish. The paper does the opposite. It puts them in competition over one specific puzzle, where they disagree. The puzzle: why did Israel intensify strikes on the 19th of June, killing dozens, drawing more than 50 Hezbollah projectiles, only hours before agreeing to yet another ceasefire, and just 2 days after a memorandum that named Lebanon? Escalate hard, then immediately stop. Three theories, three different stories about that sequence. Let me give you each one's prediction, because they are genuinely different and the difference is testable. Coercive diplomacy predicts the escalation is instrumental and terminal. Force applied to maximize leverage at the moment of agreement. The heaviest blow falls right before the truce and then it stops. Violence as a closing bid. Spoiler theory predicts the opposite shape. Escalation is anti-settlement and recurring, meant to wreck the emerging deal. So violence should spike when settlement looks most likely, and persist or resume after any truce, because the spoiler's whole goal is to prevent consolidation. A spoiler account expects this ceasefire to fail again soon, and two-level games predict the escalation is audience-directed. Its job is to satisfy a domestic constituency, here Israeli ministers pressing to intensify the fight, so leadership can sell acceptance of the broader Iran framework at home. This account expects the violence to be loud, visible, and quickly convertible into a truce once the domestic signal has been sent. Violence as a message to your own side. Three clean, competing predictions about one day. Now score them. The evidence doesn't crown one winner, and the paper resists the temptation to force one. Instead, it discriminates. The timing: heaviest strikes immediately before the truce. Then a US brokered cessation. Fits coercive diplomacy's closing bid better than spoiler theories wreck the deal, because the escalation produced a ceasefire rather than collapsing the deal. But the recurrence, this being the latest in a long line of announced then broken truces, vindicates the spoiler claim that no single cessation consolidates. And the domestic backdrop, reporting that Netanyahu sought to assuage ministers pushing to ramp up the fight, and that the US Vice President publicly defended the Iran deal against Israeli criticism, substantiates the two-level reading. So the adjudication is sequential, not exclusive. Coercive diplomacy best explains the form and timing of the 19th. Two-level games best explain its domestic function. And spoiler theory best explains the system's trajectory, why the truce is unlikely to hold. Each theory wins a different column, and the paper hands each one a specific refinement, most notably the idea of a cross-process spoiler, an actor who spoils not by openly rejecting a ceasefire, but by calibrating violence in one process to shift leverage in another. Hold that idea, it's about to matter. Now the question that decides whether any of this can hold, and this is where the human cost stops being abstract. The memorandum's first clause commits to ending the fighting in Lebanon. The United States is the guarantor of that clause, but the United States is not Israel. So the test is simple, and it cuts straight to who is dying. Could Washington actually deliver Israeli restraint? Apply the same falsification standard. If the US could restrain its closest ally, we'd expect Israeli strikes to fall after American pressure, Israel accepting the limits Washington set, the violence subsiding as the guarantor intended. If it couldn't, agency slack, we'd expect Israel continuing strikes despite explicit American objection, publicly asserting it would not stop, and Washington reduced to scolding rather than commanding. The June 2026 record is not ambiguous. President Trump pressed Netanyahu repeatedly, reportedly telling him, in a call American officials described as expletive-laden, that he was perturbed, that we got to stop this. At the G7, he said publicly, of the strikes on Lebanon, "Too many people have been killed. You do not have to knock down an apartment every time you are looking for somebody." And Israel's answer, in Netanyahu's own words, was that the military would continue operating in southern Lebanon, quote, as planned, sit with what the guarantor could not stop. Between early March and early June, Lebanon's health ministry recorded more than 3,500 people killed by Israeli strikes, a figure that climbed past 3,700 dead and roughly 12,000 wounded weeks later, with over 1 million people displaced. The UN reported children killed or maimed in Lebanon at a rate of roughly 12 a day. On a single Friday in June, Israeli strikes killed at least 47 people. One of the deadliest days of the war. The guarantor said stop. The strikes continued. Sit with what that means. The one power positioned to halt the killing publicly committed to ending the Lebanon fighting and then could not or would not make its own ally comply. A guarantor whose guarantee runs only as far as a phone call its partner can ignore is not a guarantor, it is a witness. And notice the workaround, because it's an admission. Washington signed a clause promising to end the fighting, then defended that deal in public while the strikes went on beneath it, managing the optics of restraint rather than delivering the fact of it. When the most powerful state on earth says, "We got to stop this," and the bombs keep falling, the gap between the signature and the ground is the whole story. The paper's framework names that gap precisely, an agent acting autonomously, while the principal absorbs the diplomatic credit. So this is the fault line along which the architecture cracks, and it is not symmetrical in its consequences. Coupling tells us the tracks are linked. Spoiler theory tells us the violence recurs. Two-level theory tells us domestic hardliners pushed for escalation. But principal-agent indeterminacy tells us why the killing did not stop when the deal said it would, because the actor that signed for peace does not command the actor doing the fighting. That is not an abstraction. As of this recording, it is measured in thousands of Lebanese dead. Most accounts would quietly pick a signing date and a dollar figure and move on. This paper does the opposite. It treats the contestation itself as the strongest evidence that this is visional. Take the date. The signing was reported across roughly the 14th to the 19th of June. Iranian outlets published draft details mid-month. A US official read out a revised text on the 17th, calling it signed electronically, while a formal signing was planned for later. Trump and Iran's president were described as signing around the 17th or 18th, and the framework was still being called not final after that. An agreement with a contested birth date is an agreement whose very existence as a binding act is uncertain, and the bindingness was disavowed openly. A senior US official cautioned that either side could walk away at any time until there's a fulsome binding deal. Trump himself said it wasn't final and warned he'd resume bombing if Iran didn't comply. An instrument one signatory publicly frames as revocable at will, backed by a threat to return to force, is, by its own author's description, provisional. It's a ceasefire of the diplomatic process, a pause that preserves the option of war, then the money. Iranian state-linked media reported the release of roughly $24 billion in frozen assets during the 60-day window. A US official flatly denied Iran would receive billions before negotiations, calling it spin, and a separate $12 billion figure completely not true. The text references a reconstruction plan of at least $300 billion. But US officials stress the language does not require Washington to contribute a cent, with any asset access contingent on demonstrable good behavior. The two sides read the same clauses oppositely. That gap, not any single number, is the evidence. Now the part I'd ask my Pakistani audience to sit with most carefully, because the usual framing gets the question wrong. When Pakistan's role is discussed, the debate is almost always about what Pakistan gained. One April 2026 argument held that Islamabad mediates because it can and it must, emphasizing the rapport between President Trump and Field Marshal Asim Munir. A more skeptical reading asked what Pakistan actually gains, and I found few grounds for optimism about tangible returns. But both framings, celebratory and skeptical, share one question: the ledger of gains. The paper poses a sharper one. Not what Pakistan gained, what Pakistan structurally risks, as guarantor of an instrument whose bindingness is contested and whose collapse it cannot control. And the mediation arc is real. A Pakistan-brokered ceasefire began on the 8th of April after Munir made, in the reporting, a flurry of calls. Islamabad hosted the highest-level direct US-Iran engagement since 1979. The release text bears Islamabad's name. Pakistan lent its sovereign credibility as comprehensively as a non-signatory can, which is precisely the exposure. 3 structural risks. 1. The bindingness Pakistan underwrote is publicly disavowed by a principle. When Trump calls the deal non-final and threatens bombing, the value of Pakistan's guarantee is hostage to one man's revocable preference. 2. The collapse trigger sits on a front Pakistan does not influence, violence around Nabatieh that no Pakistani channel can throttle. 3. The whole guarantee rests on a personalized leader-to-leader channel, efficient but brittle. Personalized channels don't survive a change of interlocutor or a soured relationship. On this reading, Pakistan converted a diplomatic triumph into a contingent liability, one whose resolution depends on events around the litany, not on anything decided in Islamabad or Geneva. Put it together and you get the title's claim, earned rather than asserted. A provisional architecture, a structure that survives only through continuous active management. Its load-bearing flaws. A coupling that makes the whole edifice hostage to the least controllable variable, local violence in southern Lebanon. An inherited, unaddressed asymmetry of obligation. The core question, Hezbollah's disarmament, named but unresolved, a principal who can neither deliver nor disown his agent, a compressed 60-day clock, disputed figures read oppositely, and a guarantee resting on personal rapport. None is individually fatal. Together, they describe something that stands only while someone holds it up. But here's what separates analysis from commentary. The paper commits to dated, falsifiable forecasts, so it can be checked, not just admired. 3 of them, and I'm putting them on screen with a clear projected tag, because these are predictions, not facts. 1. By the 30th of June, at least one further strike or projectile exchange in the Nabatieh Litani area after the 19th of June truce. 2. By the 20th of July, the Geneva talks will have either not convened or convened only intermittently, with at least one further postponement explicitly linked to the Lebanon front. 3. By the roughly 15th of August expiry, no final mutually described as binding deal resolving Hezbollah's disarmament and Iran's nuclear file. The likeliest outcome is an extension by mutual consent or a renewed fight over whether the memorandum even still holds. And the author commits to the reverse standard too, which is the honest part. If the truce holds cleanly, the talks proceed indifferent to Lebanon and a binding final deal lands on time. The thesis should be rejected, and this reclassified as a genuine peace process. As of production, those windows are still open. We'll know soon. Before I close, A quick note for the theory-minded, because a good case study should give something back to the frameworks it borrows. Coercive diplomacy gets a clean illustration of force as closing bid in a coupled setting, and a reminder that a successful closing bid buys a pause, not a settlement. Spoiler theory gets the cross-process spoiler, spoiling by calibrating violence in one process to shape leverage in another, never openly rejecting the ceasefire. And two-level games get a twist on Putnam. The relevant audiences here are transnational. An Israeli domestic audience constrains a bargain to which Israel isn't even a signatory. That last one is worth a beat. The classic two-level game is one leader, one home audience, one table. Here, a domestic constituency shapes a deal their state never signed. The board is bigger than the theory assumed. Let me be fair to what was achieved, because architecture not peace is not a sneer. A reopened Strait of Hormuz, a signed if contested memorandum, a functioning multilateral mediation network that pulled in an unlikely middle power broker, publics on both sides hungry for relief after a year of war. Those are real goods, and a year ago they were hard to imagine. The realistic appraisal is simply this: the architecture bought time. It lowered the immediate risk of a region-wide war. What it did not do is touch the deeper drivers: Hezbollah's arsenal, Iran's strategic posture, Israel's security doctrine, and the plain fact that the actual belligerents would not sign the document that claims to end their war. Time bought is not nothing, but it is not peace either. So here's the takeaway I'd leave you with, and it's a discipline, not a prediction. When you want to know where this region is actually heading, don't watch the podium in Geneva. Watch the ground around Nabatieh. The handshakes and the signing ceremonies are the visible part of the architecture. The load it's actually carrying runs through a stretch of southern Lebanon that no negotiator in Switzerland controls. On this analysis, the true measure of the 2026 settlement was never going to be found in a memorandum. It was always going to be found in whether the guns near the litany went quiet and stayed quiet. I set out to give you a test, not a verdict, and to run it honestly, including against itself. The paper's claim survived its strongest counter-argument, named its own mechanism of failure, and staked itself on 3 dated predictions. That's what a serious argument looks like. If this is the kind of analysis you want more of, measured, sourced, and willing to mark its own homework, subscribe and I'll see you in the next deep dive. I'm Naim Tahir Baig. Watch the ground, not the podium.